The sky of Arixa Prime was red with smoke. Broken ships burned across the horizon, and the ground was filled with the sound of distant explosions. Human soldier Mason Hale moved carefully through the ruins of a city that once belonged to the Arixans, a proud alien race. The city had been beautiful once, with shining towers of glass and stone. Now it was only dust and ash. Mason's armor was scratched and his helmet visor was cracked. He had been fighting for hours with his unit, searching for survivors and supplies. The air was hot, thick with smoke and metal dust. Each step felt heavy under the weight of his gear. His team's voices came through the communicator, but static broke their words. He could only catch a few fragments. Sector 5, stay alert. Unknown signals. He raised his rifle and moved between two broken walls. The streets were silent. Only the wind moved, carrying the smell of fire. Mason knew this kind of silence well. It was the kind that came before danger. His orders were simple. The ruins. Collect any data from Arixan computers and report back before nightfall. But as he looked around the shattered city, Mason wondered if there was anything left worth taking. The war between humans and Arixans had lasted 5 long years. Each side had lost cities, ships, and lives beyond counting. The cause had become lost in the noise of revenge. Mason stepped over a fallen statue of an Arixan warrior. It had once stood proud in the center of the street. Now only the head remained, half buried in the dust. He paused and looked at it for a moment. The carved eyes seemed to stare back at him. He shook his head and kept moving. A sound broke the silence. A faint cry. It was soft, almost lost under the wind, but it was there. Mason stopped. He turned his head slowly, listening. The sound came again. It was not the voice of a soldier. It was small, weak, frightened. He followed the sound through a narrow alley. The walls around him were covered in strange markings, the language of the Arixans. He could not read it, but he felt the weight of history in each line. The cry grew louder as he moved deeper into the ruins. It led him to what had once been a great hall, now open to the sky. Half the roof had fallen in, and smoke curled from the rubble. He lowered his weapon and stepped carefully over the broken stones. Then he saw her. A small figure was trapped under a fallen pillar. She was tiny, no more than 6 or 7 years old by human measure. Her skin was pale blue with faint silver lines that glowed softly. Her eyes were large and bright, filled with tears. Mason froze for a moment, unsure what he was seeing. It's an alien child. Alone hurt? She saw him and tried to move, but the stone held her leg. Her voice trembled as she spoke in her language. Words Mason could not understand. She was scared, but her eyes showed more confusion than hate. Mason dropped his rifle and hurried forward. He pushed at the pillar, but it was too heavy. He looked around and found a metal beam nearby. Using it as a lever, he strained until the stone shifted just enough to pull her free. When she was loose, he lifted her gently into his arms. She was light, fragile like glass. Her breathing was uneven, and a small cut on her head leaked faint blue blood. Mason opened a pouch from his armor and used a clean cloth to press against the wound. The child looked at him with wide eyes. She said something again, voice soft, like a question. He could not answer her words, but he gave a calm nod to show she was safe. He tapped his communicator. "Command, this is Hale. I found a survivor. Civilian, maybe a child. Need medical evac?" Static answered him. The signal was gone. The orbital relay must have been destroyed in the battle. He was alone. He sighed and looked at the child again. She clung weakly to his armor, her small hand gripping his arm. He knew what command would say if they found out. Arixan civilians were to be registered and sent to containment zones, and he never came back. Mason thought of that and felt a heavy stone settle in his chest. He looked around the hall again. The walls had carvings showing scenes of Arixans standing beside humans, shaking hands, exchanging gifts. It was an old memory from before the war. Maybe this city had once believed in peace. He wondered if this child had ever seen a day without fear. The sound of engines echoed in the distance. Mason looked up and saw dust rising, patrol drones sweeping the area. He knew they were programmed to attack anything that moved. He crouched low and pulled the child close. He whispered quietly, even though she might not understand. "Stay still. Don't make a sound." The drones passed overhead, scanning with red lights. Mason waited until the noise faded before he stood again. The girl trembled but did not cry. Her courage surprised him. He carried her out of the ruins and toward the hills beyond the city, where his team had set up a temporary camp. As he walked, he looked down at her again. She was staring at his face through the cracked visor. Her voice came out in a whisper. "Tara," she said, tapping her chest. He realized she was telling him her name. "Tara," Mason repeated slowly. She gave a small nod. Her lips curved into a faint smile. He smiled back, the first real smile he had made in days. When he reached the camp, he saw it had been hit. Smoke rose from the broken tents and armored carriers. He hurried inside, searching for survivors, but there were none. The battle had moved here too, and his team was gone. Mason sat down beside a broken wall and placed the girl beside him. She looked around at the wreckage with wide eyes. He handed her a water pouch. She hesitated, but then took it and drank carefully. He spoke softly, more to himself than to her. "Guess it's just us now." She watched him for a moment, then reached into the small pouch on her belt. She took out a thin crystal shard, glowing faint blue. She pressed it into his hand and said something in her language. He could not understand, but the gesture was clear. It was thanks. He looked at the shard. It was warm to the touch, and when he held it up, tiny lights shimmered inside it like stars. He placed it carefully into his armor pocket and nodded. Double quotes. "Thank you, Tara." Night began to fall, and the cold wind blew across the ruins. Mason gathered what supplies he could find. He started a small fire from the broken crates, careful to keep the smoke low. Tara sat beside him, wrapped in his cloak. Her eyes reflected the light like glass. She did not seem as afraid anymore. Mason looked at the stars. Somewhere up there, the human fleet was regrouping. Somewhere else, the Oricsan army was doing the same. Both sides waiting for the next command, the next strike. But here, in this small circle of light, none of that seemed to matter. He wondered how long the war would go on. He wondered how many more children, human or alien, would be lost before it ended. Tara began to hum a tune, soft and strange, a melody that echoed in the empty night. It was beautiful and sad. Mason listened, feeling something inside him shift. He had seen too much pain, too much hate. But this sound, this small act of peace, cut through the noise of war like sunlight through smoke. When the fire burned low, Tara leaned against him and fell asleep. Mason adjusted his cloak around her and sat still, keeping watch. Every distant sound made his hand tighten around his rifle, but none came close. He looked down at the sleeping child. In another world, she might have been his enemy. Yet here she was, just a child who needed help. He knew he could not leave her. He would protect her, no matter what his orders said. Before dawn, Mason stood and prepared his gear. He looked at the city one last time. The ruins were quiet again. Only the wind moved through the broken towers. He lifted Tara into his arms. She stirred slightly but did not wake. He whispered softly, "Let's get you home." As the first light of morning touched the horizon, Mason began to walk. The fire of war still burned in the distance, but his path was clear. He did not know what waited ahead. He only knew that he had made a choice to be human, even in the middle of a war. And far above, unseen by him, a signal flickered in the Oricsan sky. A message was sent from a desperate queen searching for her missing daughter. The morning on Orixa Prime was cold and quiet. The red sky had turned gray, covered by clouds that hid the sun. Mason Hale walked carefully through the hills beyond the ruined city, carrying the small alien child in his arms. Her name was Tara, and she slept lightly, her head resting against his chest. Every few minutes she opened her eyes, looked at him, and then closed them again, as if she was still unsure if she could trust him. Mason had no map, no working communicator, and no backup. His armor showed low power, and his supplies were running short. The camp was destroyed, and the battlefield stretched far across the horizon. Yet he kept walking. He had made a promise to himself that he would keep her safe. He reached an old transport tunnel that led into the mountains. The tunnel had once been used by Ericsson's civilians to move between cities. Now, it was half buried by fallen rocks. Mason squeezed through the opening, holding Tara close to shield her from dust. Inside, the air was cooler and the light dim. He set her down gently on the ground. She looked around with wide eyes. The walls of the tunnel glowed faintly with blue lines that ran along the stone-like veins. Mason guessed it was some kind of old power network still working after all this time. The glow reflected on Tara's silver markings, making her seem like part of the tunnel itself. Mason opened a ration pack and handed her a small piece of protein bread. She sniffed it first, then took a careful bite. The taste made her frown, but she ate it anyway. Mason smiled a little. "It's not good, I know," he said quietly, "but it will keep you strong." She tilted her head, not understanding his words, but she smiled back. Then she pointed at the bread and said something in her own language, a short word that sounded like food.
Mason
Repeated it, and she nodded, laughing softly. He repeated it again, and she clapped her small hands. In that dark tunnel for a moment, the sound of war felt far away. After eating, Mason checked his equipment. His rifle had little charge left, and the medkit was nearly empty. He looked at the child again. Her leg was bruised but healing. He knew she needed proper medical care, something he could not give. The human base was too far, and if he brought her there, they might take her away from him. He could not risk that. He sat down beside her and pulled out the glowing crystal she had given him the night before. He turned it in his hand, watching the lights dance inside. Tara saw it and reached for it, pointing at the glow and saying a few words. Mason tried to repeat them. She smiled and nodded again, pleased that he understood even a little. He looked at the crystal more closely. It seemed to hum softly when he held it. He wondered if it was some kind of signal device, something that could lead the Ericssons to them. The thought worried him, but when he saw how much it meant to her, he decided to keep it close. It was a part of her, and he would not take that away. Hours passed inside the tunnel. Mason and Tara rested near a small alcove, hidden from view. The child drew shapes in the dust with her finger. Mason watched her and tried to guess what the shapes meant. Some looked like stars, some like tall towers. He realized she was drawing her home. She pointed to one of the towers and spoke a name that sounded like Aryan. Then she touched her chest and said, "Tara." Finally, she pointed at him and waited. Mason smiled and tapped his chest. "Mason." She repeated it, the sound strange in her soft voice. "Mason." He laughed gently. Close enough, their simple exchange filled the silence with warmth. For a man who had seen too many dark days, that small connection felt like light breaking through the clouds, but the moment did not last long. A sharp sound echoed from the tunnel entrance. Mason froze. He lifted his rifle and turned off the small lantern. The light from the walls was enough to see faint movement in the distance. A shadow passed between the blue lines. More followed. He counted 3 shapes, moving quietly, scanning with bright red sensors. "Human drones," Mason whispered softly to Tara, motioning for her to stay low. She obeyed without question. Her eyes were wide, but she stayed quiet. The drones swept the tunnel, searching for survivors or enemy soldiers. Their sensors clicked as they passed. Mason knew their systems would detect heat, so he pressed his armor against the cold wall and held Tara close, covering her with his cloak to block their body heat. The drones came closer. The red lights passed over the rocks, stopping for a moment near them. Mason did not move. Tara trembled in his arms, but stayed silent. After what felt like forever, the lights moved on. The drones continued deeper into the tunnel. Mason waited until the sound of their rotors faded, then exhaled slowly. Tara looked up at him, her eyes shining with fear and relief. Mason whispered, "It's all right. They are gone." She did not understand the words, but she understood the tone. She nodded and leaned against him, her small hand clutching his sleeve. When it was safe again, Mason stood and checked the way ahead. The tunnel led out toward the mountain ridge. Beyond that, there was an old human supply station marked on his map from before the battle. If it was still standing, they could rest there. He lifted Tara once more and began the long climb. The tunnel twisted upward, the walls changing from smooth stone to rough metal. Old signs written in both human and Oricsan script hung on the walls. It was a reminder that this world had once been shared between both races, before greed and fear turned them into enemies. When they reached the exit, the sun had set again. The sky glowed faint orange over the horizon. The mountains stretched far, covered with gray sand and scattered wrecks of old machines. Mason could see smoke rising from what looked like a distant base. He adjusted his visor and started walking toward it. Tara was quiet, resting her head against his shoulder. Every now and then she opened her eyes and looked around with curiosity. Mason wondered what she thought of him, a soldier from the race that had destroyed her city. Yet she did not look at him with hate. She looked at him with trust. That thought gave him strength to keep going. After several hours, Mason reached the remains of the supply station. It was half buried under rock, but one side of the structure was still intact. He forced the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled stale but clean. He set Tara down and checked the control panel. The emergency lights came on, bathing the room in soft white glow. The place was small, with a few bunks, a storage unit, and a working water filter. Mason smiled in relief. They finally had shelter. He found a blanket and wrapped it around Tara. She looked around, touching the smooth walls with wonder. He could tell she had never been inside a human structure before. He opened another ration pack and shared it with her. This time, she ate more easily, growing used to the taste. After eating, she began to hum again, the same soft song as before. Mason listened quietly. Her voice filled the room like gentle wind. When she finished, he clapped softly, and she laughed, shy but happy. Later that night, when she had fallen asleep, Mason sat near the door and recorded a message on his damaged communicator. Even though it had no signal, "This is Sergeant Mason Hale, Unit Alpha 3. I have found a survivor, an Oricsan child named Tara. She is unarmed and harmless. I am proceeding toward friendly territory, but will avoid contact until further notice. She is my responsibility now." Stopped the recording and looked at her sleeping form. She was curled up under the blanket, her silver markings glowing faintly in the dim light. He thought of his orders, of what the command would say if they knew he had protected her. He might be branded a traitor, but he could not bring himself to care. He had seen too much hate. He would not add to it. Suddenly, a faint beep came from the storage unit. Mason turned quickly and opened it. Inside was an old communication console, still working. The screen flickered to life, showing a series of alien symbols. The crystal in his pocket began to glow, responding to the signal. Mason realized it must have activated some hidden link. The signal was strong, and from the markings on the screen, it was coming from deep within Oricsan territory. He frowned and looked at Tara. If the signal connected to her people, they might already be searching for her. That could bring trouble from both sides. Still, he could not ignore it. If it led to her home, maybe it was the only way to return her safely. He sat back and watched the blinking lights. The crystal pulsed gently, matching Tara's heartbeat as she slept. Mason felt a strange calm wash over him. In a galaxy filled with endless war, this tiny connection between a human soldier and an alien child felt more powerful than any weapon. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains. Mason stayed awake, guarding her through the night. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew his path was set. He would not hand her over to anyone who wanted to use her. He would find her family, even if it meant crossing into enemy space. The war had taken too much from both sides. Maybe this one act could start to heal something broken long ago. As he looked at the child sleeping peacefully, Mason whispered a silent promise to the stars that he would see this through to the end. The morning on Orixa Prime was heavy with fog. Mason Hale and Tara had spent the night in the old supply station. The hum of the crystal in his pocket continued to pulse gently, almost like it was alive. Mason watched Tara as she woke, blinking slowly in the pale light. She yawned, stretched her small arms, and looked at him with curiosity. Her eyes still held a trace of fear, but there was trust too. That trust had become the most important thing in Mason's life. He prepared a small, breakfast from the remaining ration packs. Tara ate quickly, and Mason noticed she was stronger today. Her leg bruise had begun to heal, and her small blue body moved with more confidence. He felt relieved, but also aware that the next steps would be dangerous. The signal from the crystal was strong. He knew it was a message from her people. The Oricsan queen was likely searching for her daughter. That search would bring soldiers, drones, and patrols, all of which could endanger them both. Mason decided it was time to move. He packed what little supplies remained, checking his rifle and medkit carefully. Tara clutched the glowing crystal as he placed her cloak around her shoulders. She looked at him, eyes wide, then said a word he had begun to understand. Home. Mason nodded silently. He did not know exactly where home was, but he had a strong feeling that they would find it together. The mountains ahead were rugged and dangerous. Mason knew that traveling through enemy territory alone would be almost impossible. Human and Oricsan patrols moved constantly across the battlefield. One wrong step could bring death. Yet, he could not wait for orders. Waiting would only increase the risk. He had seen the destruction war brought to children, and Tara was proof of that suffering. He had to act. They started walking through the fog, careful not to leave tracks. The air was damp, and the ground was slippery. Tara clung to him when the paths became narrow or steep. Mason whispered reassurances in his low voice, even though she could not understand most of his words. His presence alone seemed to calm her. Each step felt heavier as the fog thickened, but Mason pressed on. Every ruined city, every abandoned battlefield reminded him of what was at stake. Hours passed, and they reached the edge of a valley. The valley was filled with old Oricsan ruins, half-buried towers, and broken streets. Mason lowered Tara to the ground. He wanted her to see the world around her, even if it was not her home. She walked slowly, touching the broken stones with her small hands. Mason could tell she was remembering things, places she had known before the war. Her breathing became faster, excited, almost like hope had entered her heart. Suddenly, the silence of the valley was broken by a distant roar. Mason raised his rifle, scanning the horizon. A human patrol was approaching, moving quickly through the ruins. Mason realized they must be looking for survivors or signs of enemy activity. If they found him with Tara, they would take her immediately. He could not allow that. The Oricsan child was not just a piece of intelligence. She was a living being who trusted him. He grabbed Tara's hand and led her behind a fallen tower. They crouched low as the patrol passed, soldiers scanning the ruins with sharp eyes. Tara trembled slightly, but did not cry. Mason whispered, "Stay close. Do not make a sound." She nodded, understanding his tone. The patrol passed, and Mason exhaled slowly. They were safe for now, but danger would follow them for every step of the journey. The path to the signal grew steeper. Mason carried Tara up rocky hills, careful to avoid making noise. Each movement required patience and caution. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and metal. Mason felt the weight of responsibility. He had never imagined himself as a protector of an alien child. Yet here he was, risking everything to save a life that was not his own. It was strange, but Mason knew that humanity was not measured by nationality or species. It was measured by actions, by courage, by mercy. By mid-afternoon, they reached an old observatory perched on a cliff. Mason examined the structure. The dome was partially collapsed, but inside he found old communication equipment, surprisingly intact. The crystal in Tara's hand pulsed brightly, almost as if it recognized the technology. Mason realized this could be their key. If he could use the old equipment, he might send a signal that would guide them safely to Tara's family, as he worked on the console. Tara explored the observatory carefully. She ran her fingers over ancient alien devices, pointing out markings and symbols that Mason could not understand. Occasionally, she spoke softly in her language, naming the objects. Mason tried to remember the sounds. Every word felt important, a bridge to a world he had never known. Despite the danger outside, inside the observatory felt calm, almost safe. It was a momentary pause in the chaos of war. While Mason repaired the console, he noticed movement outside. A group of Oricsan scouts had entered the valley. Their armor shimmered in the fading sunlight. They were not hostile at first glance, but Mason knew better. Any Oricsan who saw Tara with a human could react with anger or fear. He quickly gestured for Tara to hide in a corner behind a pile of debris. She obeyed silently, her small body pressed against the shadows. The scouts moved cautiously, their eyes scanning every corner. Mason held his breath, ready to act if needed. One of the scouts paused, looking directly at the observatory. Mason froze, hoping the shadows and fog would hide them. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly the scouts moved past, their attention elsewhere. Mason exhaled quietly, relieved. Tara peeked out from behind the debris, her small eyes wide with curiosity and relief. Once the scouts were gone, Mason turned to Tara. He pointed at the crystal, then at the console, and made gestures that she began to understand. Tara's eyes lit up, and she placed the crystal into the console slot. The device hummed to life, lights flickering across the room. Mason watched as a holographic map appeared, showing a path through the mountains toward a hidden city. Mason realized that the device was a guide created to help Tara find her family if she was lost. He smiled at her. "We found a way home." Tara clapped her hands and laughed softly. Mason felt a warmth in his chest, a mix of hope and relief. They could not stay here long. Both human and Oricsan forces could appear at any moment. Mason knew he had to move quickly. He packed his gear, checked his rifle, and prepared to continue. Tara followed, holding his hand tightly as they left the observatory behind. The journey was long and difficult. The mountains grew taller and the paths narrower. Every step required careful navigation. Mason kept watch constantly, scanning for patrols or predators. Tara remained close, her small hand never leaving his. She began to speak more in her language, pointing at rocks, birds, and the distant horizon. Mason smiled, repeating her words when he could. Communication was slow. Their bond was growing stronger with each passing hour. As night approached, they found a small cave for shelter. Mason set up a fire using the remaining supplies. Tara watched in fascination as the flames danced. He handed her a small piece of bread. She ate quietly, then held the glowing crystal up to the fire. The crystal reflected the light, casting tiny stars across the cave walls. Mason watched, feeling that even in this world of war, beauty could still exist. During the night, Tara slept again, curled against him for warmth. Mason kept watch outside the cave, scanning the dark horizon. He thought about the risks ahead. Every mile they traveled brought them closer to her family, but also closer to danger. He knew the Oricsan queen had likely sent scouts and drones, searching for her lost daughter. Mason understood that returning Tara safely would require not just courage, but careful planning. As the stars appeared in the sky, Mason allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had never imagined himself in this role, protector of a child from another species. Yet the responsibility filled him with purpose. He had seen the darkness of war, the cruelty on both sides, but in this small child he saw hope. If one human could show mercy, perhaps there could be a chance for peace. Before dawn, Mason packed their belongings again. Tara was awake and ready. She spoke a word that sounded like go, and Mason nodded. Together, they left the cave, climbing higher into the mountains. The crystal in Tara's hand pulsed brightly, guiding their path. Mason followed closely, determined to see the journey through. The first rays of sunlight touched the horizon, casting long shadows across the mountains. Mason and Tara moved forward, united by trust and determination. Ahead lay the hidden city, her family, and perhaps the chance to end a long chapter of fear and loss. Behind them, the war still raged, but for Mason, the only focus was the child who had entrusted her life to him. In the silence of the morning, Mason whispered softly, "We will get you home, Tara, I promise." The crystal pulsed, as if in answer, and for the first time in a long time, Mason felt hope. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead, gray and jagged under the early morning sun. Mason Hale carried Tara in his arms as they navigated narrow paths carved into steep cliffs. Every step was careful, measured. One misstep could send them tumbling down hundreds of meters. Tara clung tightly to him, but she had grown stronger during their journey. She had learned to trust him completely, and her small voice began to guide him in her own way. She pointed at paths, whispered words in her language, and sometimes even smiled. Mason answered her with nods and quiet words of encouragement. They moved slowly, but steadily, toward the hidden city that the crystal had shown them. Mason knew the signal led directly to Tara's people. The Oricsan queen was searching for her daughter, and every second they stayed in the open could bring danger. Both human and Oricsan patrols could be watching. Mason had seen too many battles to underestimate the danger. He kept his rifle ready, scanning the rocky cliffs and valleys below. By mid-morning, and they reached a narrow pass known among humans as the Fire Line. It was a dangerous area where explosions from past battles had scarred the earth. Craters, burned-out vehicles, and broken drones littered the path. The ground was uneven, unstable. Mason stepped carefully, testing each rock before placing his weight. Tara stayed close, her small hand gripping his armor. She looked at him and asked something in her language, pointing at the scorched valley below. Mason nodded. He understood. This was no place for anyone to run carelessly. As they crossed, the wind picked up, whistling through the broken towers of metal and stone. A cloud of dust rose from a crater nearby. Mason froze. He lifted Tara close and crouched behind a fallen drone. The air shimmered with heat, and he could hear distant movement. A human patrol had entered the valley. They were searching for survivors, scavenging for equipment, and likely would not hesitate to report anything unusual. Mason motioned for Tara to stay low. She pressed herself against him, silent. He watched the patrol move slowly, their sensors scanning the ruined valley. One soldier paused and turned toward their hiding place. Mason held his breath. Tara's heart beat fast against his chest. The patrol's gaze lingered, then they moved on. Mason exhaled slowly. "We're safe for now," but he knew it would not last. He looked at Tara and whispered, "Stay close. We're almost there." She nodded and rested her head against his shoulder. Mason knew the hidden city was only a few hours away, but the path was dangerous. The fire line was filled with traps, old landmines, and unstable structures. He had to find a safe route, one that would not trigger alarms or alert patrols. Every step required careful thought. They continued across the valley, stepping over twisted metal and broken vehicles. Mason found old paths that seemed less disturbed, using his experience as a soldier to avoid danger. Tara pointed at a small crevice in the rocks. Mason nodded. They could take shelter there if patrols returned. She smiled, and for the first time, Mason felt a spark of hope. Her trust in him had become a bond that gave him strength to continue. By afternoon, they reached a cliffside overlooking a river. The water shimmered in the sunlight, flowing through the valley like a ribbon of silver. Mason set Tara down for a moment to rest. She sat on a rock, looking at the water and pointing, speaking in her language. Mason could not understand the words, but he sensed her excitement. The river was their next challenge. It was wide, fast, and full of sharp rocks. Crossing it would be dangerous, but necessary. Mason found a narrow part of the river where the current was weaker. He held Tara close and stepped in carefully. The water was cold, rushing past them with a powerful force. Tara gripped him tightly, her small hands strong despite her size. Mason focused on each step, testing the rocks beneath the water. His boots slipped once, but he caught himself and held Tara closer. They moved slowly, carefully, till the other side was within reach. When they finally reached the opposite bank, Mason set Tara down on dry ground. She jumped lightly, laughing softly, and pointed at the hills ahead. Mason smiled. The hidden city was close. The crystal in her hand pulsed brightly, guiding them forward. The path led them into a dense forest of gray and blue trees, the only vegetation that had survived the battles. The canopy blocked the sun, making the forest dim and quiet, careful to keep both of them hidden. As they moved through the forest, Mason noticed small signs of other travelers. Broken branches, footprints, and the occasional empty pack showed that others had passed this way recently. Some were human, some were Erikson. He kept watch constantly, knowing that the slightest mistake could alert someone. Tara followed silently, learning from his movements, copying his cautious steps. Her small size and speed made her an advantage. She could move quickly and quietly through spaces he could not fit into. Hours passed, and the forest began to thin. Mason paused to check their position. Crystal in Tara's hand pulsed faster, stronger. They were very close. He felt a mixture of relief and tension. This was the moment when danger was highest. Any patrol could appear at any second. Mason adjusted his rifle and prepared for confrontation. Tara noticed his movements and pressed against him, her small hand on his armor. He gave her a reassuring nod. They were ready. Suddenly a drone appeared above the forest canopy. Its sensors scanned rapidly. Mason froze and crouched behind a tree. Tara pressed herself closer to him, silent. The drone hovered, searching, then moved on without detecting them. Mason exhaled slowly. The forest provided enough cover, but he knew they could not stay hidden forever. The hidden city was near. But the closer they got, the more likely they would be seen. By late afternoon, they reached a ridge overlooking a valley filled with tall, gleaming towers. Mason recognized the architecture immediately. These were Erikson structures, untouched by war. The hidden city was alive, full of movement and light. He could see people moving along the streets, small flying vehicles and guards at every entrance. Tara gasped and pointed, her eyes wide with recognition. Mason smiled gently. She had found her home. The challenge was now to enter safely. Mason studied the layout. There were multiple entrances, but most were heavily guarded. He decided to use a small, unused service tunnel leading under the city. Tara followed him closely as they descended into the hidden passage. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and smelled of damp stone. Tara held the crystal, which pulsed faintly, lighting their way. Mason moved slowly, checking each corner, listening for sounds of guards. Finally, they emerged in a quiet courtyard within the city. The streets were filled with civilians, but there was no chaos. Tara ran ahead, calling out softly in her language. People turned and looked, their faces lighting up with recognition. Mason stayed behind, watching her move. Then he saw it, a tall, regal figure approaching quickly. Her blue skin glowed. In the sunlight, her silver markings brilliant, and her eyes filled with emotion. The Erikson Queen. Tara ran into her mother's arms, and the Queen's expression changed from worry to relief, then to tears. Mason stepped back, giving them space. He had never seen such raw emotion before. The Queen held Tara tightly, her body shaking, her tears falling freely. She spoke in her language, rapid and filled with gratitude. Tara hugged her mother, smiling and laughing softly. Mason watched silently, feeling the weight of what he had accomplished. He had returned her safely, and in doing so, he had done something more important than any battle he had ever fought. The Queen turned slowly and looked at Mason. There was a long pause. Mason expected anger, accusations, or at least suspicion. But instead, her eyes softened. She stepped closer, her tears still falling. She bowed slightly, a gesture of respect that transcended language. Mason felt a strange warmth in his chest. He had risked everything to protect a child who was not his own. And now that choice had bridged two worlds. The Queen spoke again. This time in a tone that Mason could not fully understand, but the meaning was clear. She thanked him, offering not words of authority, but respect and recognition. Tara held the crystal in her hands and looked at Mason, her small face shining with happiness. She pointed at him, saying something that sounded like friend. Mason nodded quietly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and dangerous, but it had led to this moment. The child was safe, and the Queen was reunited with her daughter. As the sun set over the hidden city, Mason stood quietly on the courtyard, watching the reunion. The war still raged outside, but in this small moment, peace had been restored. A bond had been formed that could change the course of the future. The Erikson Queen's tears were not only for the return of her daughter, but for the realization that a human could act with mercy and courage. Mason had shown that even in a galaxy filled with conflict, compassion could exist. He knew that the next steps would be challenging. The war would not end immediately. But he also knew that his choice had made a difference. One act of courage, one decision to protect life over orders, had created hope where there had been only fear. And that hope was stronger than any weapon. Mason turned and looked at the horizon, thinking about the journey that lay ahead. Tara was safe, her family was reunited, and a small bridge had been built between humans and Erixons. The path forward would be difficult, but for the first time in years, Mason felt that he had a purpose beyond survival. He had shown. The great hall of the Threxian palace was silent. Light poured through tall crystal windows, casting soft patterns on the marble floor. The air smelled faintly of rain and metal, a mix of alien beauty and solemn peace. Human and Threxian guards stood side by side for the first time since the war had begun. The war was officially over, but the memory of it still lived in every mind present that day. Rian stood at the center of the hall with the small Threxian girl, Lyra, by his side. She held his hand tightly, her violet eyes shining with hope and fear together. She had grown stronger since he found her, but she still woke up at night calling for her mother. Today would change that. At the end of the hall, on a raised platform surrounded by golden vines, sat the Threxian queen. She was tall and graceful, with pale silver skin and eyes like deep blue stars. Her crown looked less like a symbol of power and more like a reminder of all she had lost. When she saw the child standing beside Rian, her breath caught in her throat. For a long moment, the hall was silent. The queen stood slowly, her hands trembling slightly. Rian guided Lyra forward. The little girl ran a few steps ahead and then stopped, unsure if she should continue. The queen's voice shook as she spoke.
Lyra.
The child looked up, her lips quivering. Then she ran across the floor and threw her arms around her mother. The queen fell to her knees, holding her daughter close, tears slipping down her cheeks. The guards lowered their heads out of respect. Rian stood quietly, watching the reunion. He had seen many things during the war, but nothing compared to this moment. The sound of the queen crying softly while holding her daughter was not the sound of sorrow. It was the sound of something broken, finally healing. After a while, the queen lifted her gaze to Rian. Her eyes were full of emotion that words could not describe. She stood, still holding Lyra's hand, and approached him. "You brought her back," she said softly. "When everyone thought she was gone, you searched for her." Rian nodded. "I'd found her alone in the ruins. Couldn't leave her there. She needed someone, and I guess that someone was me." The queen looked at him for a long time, studying his face. "You could have taken her to your leaders. You could have used her as a weapon of negotiation, but you did not." Rian shook his head. "She's just a child. No one should be used for anything like that. I only wanted to take her home." The queen's expression softened even more. She knelt slightly, placing her hand over her heart in the Threxian gesture of deep respect. "You have given back what the universe took from me. I can never repay this." Rian smiled a little. "You don't have to. Just promise me this war stays over." The queen nodded slowly. "There will be no more war. You have my word." Lyra tugged on Rian's sleeve. "You come with us?" she asked in a small voice. Rian crouched to her level. "I can't, little one. My home is far away. But you're safe now, and your mother will take care of you." Lyra looked down, trying to hold back tears. The queen placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He must return to his people, my child. But his kindness will always be remembered among us." Rian stood again, taking one last look at the child he had protected through endless danger. Every step of the journey back to the Threxian capital had tested his strength and patience, but it had also taught him something. Even across the stars, kindness spoke a language all beings understood. The queen signaled her attendance. And a small silver box was brought forward. She opened it and took out a smooth crystal sphere that glowed faintly from within. "This is the heart of Orthia," she said. "It carries the memory of this world. As long as it exists, this planet will remember your name." Rian accepted the gift carefully. The crystal felt warm in his hands. "Thank you," he said quietly. When he turned to leave, the queen spoke again. "Rian of Earth," she said, her voice clear and strong. Today you have done more than end a war. You have shown that even after so much darkness, light can still be born from the hearts of living beings. Wherever your kind travels, they will be welcomed in this part of the stars." Rian stopped for a moment, looking back. Then maybe there's hope for all of us after all. Left the palace, walking through the gardens that surrounded it. The air was calm, and for the first time in years, he felt peace. The human shuttle was waiting at the edge of the courtyard. As he climbed aboard, he looked through the window and saw Lyra waving from the palace steps. The queen stood beside her, one hand raised in silent farewell. The engines hummed softly as the shuttle rose into the green sky. Rian held the glowing, crystal close, watching the planet grow smaller beneath him. The stars spread out before him like a sea of light. Weeks passed as he traveled back toward human space. The journey was long, but his heart felt lighter than it had in years. Every now and then he would take out the heart of Orthia and watch it glow faintly in the dark of the ship. It reminded him that compassion could survive even in the coldest corners of the galaxy. When Rian finally returned to Earth, he was greeted as a hero. But he didn't feel like one. He felt like a messenger carrying a story the universe needed to hear. In the halls of the Human Alliance, when the leaders asked him how the war ended, he simply said, "It ended with kindness." The Alliance decided to send envoys to the Threxian Empire. For the first time in history, human ships entered Threxian orbit not for battle, but for peace. Trade routes opened and scientists shared their knowledge. Slowly, trust began to grow where hatred once lived. Years went by, and Rian continued his work as a peace officer between the two worlds. He visited Orthia once more and saw how the planet had begun to heal. The skies were clearer, and the fields glowed with new life. He met the queen again, who welcomed him like an old friend. Lyra, now older and stronger, ran to him with a smile that could brighten any room. "See," she said proudly, "no more war." Rian smiled. "That's the best thing I've heard in a long time." The queen joined them, her expression calm and full of quiet pride. "You see the change you started," she said. "The seeds of peace grow slowly, but they do grow." They walked through the garden where new trees had begun to bloom. Flowers were a strange mix of human and Threxian species planted together to symbolize unity. As the soft wind moved through the leaves, Rian felt that same peace he had felt on the day he left the palace. Before he returned to his ship, the queen handed him a small tablet made of silver. "This holds our first written treaty," she said. "Your name is carved beside mine." Rian touched the inscription. It felt unreal that a simple soldier had become a bridge between two species. When he returned to his vessel and prepared for departure, Lyra ran up to him again. She placed something in his hand, a smaller crystal, glowing faintly blue. "So you remember us," she said softly. He nodded. "I'll never forget." The ship lifted off, carrying him toward the stars once again. As Arthea faded into the distance, Rian looked out at the endless expanse ahead. He thought about how small one life seemed in the universe, yet how much difference a single act of kindness could make. Back on Earth, he kept the crystals on his desk. They glowed gently in the dark, a reminder of a world once at war, and a queen who cried not for loss, but for hope. Whenever new soldiers came to him for advice, he would tell them the same thing. Bravery isn't only about fighting. Sometimes it's about caring when everyone else forgets how. Years later, when the story of the war was told across colonies and starships, it was no longer called the Human Threxian War. It became known as the war that ended, with a child's return, and somewhere beyond the stars, on a world covered. In silver forests and green clouds, a queen looked up at the sky every night and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for the human soldier, who returned her daughter and changed the destiny of two worlds forever.